The clock struck midnight, and the last train of the night pulled into the deserted station. Its doors creaked open, revealing an eerie emptiness. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. A lone figure stepped off the train and looked around, feeling a sense of unease in the silent stillness. The station was old and decrepit, with peeling paint and broken windows. The dimly lit platform was almost entirely deserted, except for a few flickering lights and the shadows they cast. The figure shivered, pulling their coat tighter around them, and headed towards the exit. But as they walked towards the stairs, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It was a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of their own footsteps. They stopped in their tracks, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the darkness beneath the stairs. The figure hesitated for a moment, then cautiously made their way towards the stairs. As they got closer, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once in a language the figure couldn't understand. They took a deep breath and reached out to grab the handrail. But as their fingers touched the cold metal, something brushed against them. It was a hand, cold and clammy, reaching up from the darkness. The figure recoiled, stumbling backwards and falling onto the platform. They looked up, heart racing, and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered gown, with long black hair and pale skin. The figure scrambled to their feet, backing away slowly. The woman's eyes were fixed on them, cold and empty, and she began to move towards them. The figure turned to run, but their feet seemed rooted to the ground. They could feel the woman's breath on their neck, and the whispering voices were growing louder and more frenzied. Suddenly, the figure felt a hand on their shoulder, and they spun around to face a man. He was dressed in a conductor's uniform, with a kindly expression on his face. "Don't be afraid," he said softly. "This is just a trick of the mind. It happens to everyone who comes here at night." The figure looked at him incredulously, but then they realized that the whispers had stopped and the woman had vanished. The platform was empty once again, except for the conductor and the figure. "Come with me," the conductor said, gesturing towards the exit. "I'll take you to a safe place." The figure nodded, still shaking from the experience, and followed the conductor towards the stairs. As they climbed up, the conductor began to tell them the story of the station. It had been built over 100 years ago and was said to be haunted by the ghosts of the passengers who had died in a train crash. The figure listened in horror as the conductor described the terrible accident and the screams of the trapped passengers as the flames consumed them. The conductor himself had been on duty that night and had barely escaped with his life. As they emerged onto the street, the figure looked back at the station. It seemed to loom ominously in the darkness, its broken windows staring back at them like empty eyes. Suddenly, a loud roar echoed through the station, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The figure looked back in terror and saw a giant, shadowy figure emerging from the darkness. It had glowing red eyes and sharp, jagged teeth. The conductor grabbed their arm. "We have to run," he yelled, dragging them away from the station. They ran through the streets, their hearts pounding as the monster pursued them, its footsteps echoing behind them. The figure felt a cold sweat break out on their forehead, and their legs burned with exertion. They had never run so hard in their life. Finally, they reached a small park, and the conductor led them towards a bench. He pulled out a small, silver whistle from his pocket and blew into it. The whistle emitted a high-pitched noise, and the monster stopped in its tracks, its head jerking towards the sound. The conductor grabbed the figure's hand and pulled them behind the bench. "Stay here," he said firmly. "Don't move until I come back." The figure nodded, their hearts still racing, as the conductor stepped out from behind the bench and faced the monster. It let out a deafening roar and charged towards him. The conductor dodged to the side, then swung his lantern towards the monster's head. The lantern shattered on impact, and the monster let out a howl of pain. It staggered backwards, then lunged again. Conductor was quick, though, and he dodged and weaved, his movements almost balletic. He seemed to know exactly where the monster was going to attack, and he always managed to stay one step ahead. Finally, the monster let out a final, anguished roar and crumpled to the ground. The conductor walked back towards the bench, his clothes torn and bloodied, but his expression calm. "It's over," he said, holding out his hand. The figure took it, their own hand trembling, and they walked away from the park together. As they walked through the quiet streets, the conductor told them the rest of the story. The monster they had just fought was one of the creatures that haunted the station, attracted by the fear and anxiety of those who entered. But there was a way to stop them, he said. The silver whistle he had blown was made from melted down silver coins from the train that had crashed all those years ago. The sound it emitted was like music to the monsters, calming their rage and driving them away. The conductor walked the figure back to their own home, and they thanked him profusely for his help. They promised never to forget the horrors they had faced that night and the courage of the conductor who had saved them. As they walked up the steps to their own front door, the figure looked back at the empty street and thought they could see a faint glow coming from the direction of the station. They shivered, then hurried inside, locking the door behind them. But even as they lay in bed, trying to calm their racing heart, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking in the darkness. Something that hungered for fear and preyed on the unsuspecting. Something that would always be waiting until the next midnight train arrived at the horror station.